Idemo dalje. Složeni korisnički interfejs ne mora da bude komplikovan. Kako da rešimo složene probleme dizajna kako bismo aplikacije učinili dostupnim i upotrebljivim, maksimizirajući jasnoću i minimizirajući dvosmislenost na putu do željenog sadržaja, saznaćemo iz predavanja Vitalija Fridmana, konsultanta za korisničko iskustvo i kreativnog vođe Smashing magazina. Da vidimo najavni video za gospodina Fridmana. Hello, Vitali. Can you hear us?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you so much for having me. This is a pleasure, always a pleasure to be back in Belgrade, even although virtually.
Okay, welcome back anyway. Okay, so next 40 minutes are yours. Fire at will.
Excellent.
Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. You know, we've been very busy with many different things over the last 2 years. For me, it was a really fundamental shift, I would say, not only in terms of how we're living and how we're going to work and things like that, but really in terms of specifically work kind of thing. When I look around, like over the last 20 years or so, I was really kind of used and felt very comfortable in the world of accordions and tables and lists and cards and all that stuff. It was really predictable to me. But over the last 2 years, I ended up with projects which were really complex and really, really difficult, which in many ways involved very different approaches. So many things that used to work in the past just didn't work at all. So I had to really kind of find my way around what does it even mean to be designing these really, really complex interfaces, like, you know, transitioning from a print to digital journeys, working with many insurances, B2B, really complex environments. So it got me to this kind of conversation about what it even means, how do I deal with it? And I want to share some of those findings with you first. And specifically, when I look at complexity, right, there are many complex interfaces out there, business intelligence systems, CRM applications, healthcare, accounting, information systems, government services, you know, and all the other things like modeling, visualization, data evaluation, filtering, search. So many kind of really moving parts in there. So kind of really trying to understand them is really, really hard, right? So for me, kind of a really better way of understanding it is to break it into something that I can deal with, right? And that's specifically dealing with it on an interface level, right? Specifically like looking into some design patterns that appear a lot. When we're looking into these interfaces, it is very common to see a lot of tables, a lot of sheets, a lot of kind of really complex forms, batch actions, multi-column layout, dashboards, query builders, and of course, you always will get some sort of user roles, identifications, permissions, things like that. So it all really is a different story. So when I look in any complex problem today, I really try to break it down to something that I can reuse, and reusing meaning patterns, right? So what I want to look at today, not necessarily examples of, you know, beautifully designed interface and also beautifully designed interface, but really more about taking a look at those components and how they fit into this bigger picture of a really complex interface and getting them right. Because once we do that, we'll probably have a really good understanding of what we're going to do with the rest of the, you know, product that we're designing and building, right? And one thing is that, of course, these tools are inherently complex, right? They're just complex, not because of the way how we design them or how we plan them. They're just inherently complex because they have a lot of information that they need to display or a lot of complexity that they need to reveal. So this is an example of that, right? You can play along with removing padding, including kind of improving color contrast, things like that, but it's not going to make a big difference because at this point, what we care about is really trying to convey this amount of information in a meaningful way. A very different system, but actually very similar in many ways, is this one, right? If you happen to be working with some professionals, like in healthcare, so have very kind of expert systems that are not being used by people like you and me, but people who are really expert in very deep, I mean, we're all experts, of course, as well, in a way, to kind of intended to be used by people with a very deep expert knowledge of a particular information domain, which we might not have, right? And that goes, of course, for anything like this to anything like this, or even anything like this, right? Where you just have a lot of stuff that is happening and it seems really complex, right? But in the end, it's kind of, people are getting used to it over time because this complexity needs to be kind of somehow surfaced because this is a product that is, you know, supposed to enable people to do certain tasks, right? And obviously there are many, many, many examples of that, right? When we look around, you'll find plenty of navigation every now and again. You find plenty of calendars every now and again. You find sometimes really complex data managers and timesheets and models and windows and things like time planning, right? And sometimes it's all even kind of more extended towards some sort of a timeline, which is also a combination of timeline and potentially calendar widget. So as you can see, there are plenty of different things that are kind of happening at the same time, right? And what I really want to do is to try to break it all down into something manageable that all of us can use, right? This is kind of my goal. And in particular, right, when I think about the goals that I have in my work, it's always very simple, at least to me, right? This is essentially everything that I'm trying to follow. And I think that this is a pretty reliable set of principles to have. Whenever we're creating anything, whenever we're improving anything, I want to get a maximum clarity and minimum errors. I don't care about only the speed of interaction, but I care about the accuracy of data that's being submitted into the system. I care about the accuracy of conclusions that people draw from using the system, from looking at the data, from exploring the data, from filtering, searching, sorting, managing data. This is as important as being fast, right? We can think that we are pretty good at creating interfaces that look great, but we also need to facilitate understanding, which I think is really, really critical for these kind of systems, right? And so I also want a very simple, sensible, and predictable order of the way of how we ask questions, the way of how we present answers, right? The way we kind of query certain information from our database and so on and so forth, right? I don't want to have any irrelevant or redundant things that people cannot really deal with. That goes for generic error messages that don't communicate anything. This also goes for things that are, we're kind of asking things which we should not be asking, like, for example, the marital status or the gender, right? Those things should probably not be in those forms, right? And of course, just some simple things. It's a good idea to just start easily to get people in so they feel like they're making progress and avoid anything that can slow them down. And also, giving people a way out. This is actually quite important because I'm sure that many of you have been in this situation before when an interface is letting you down, literally letting you down. For example, in a checkout, you need to type in your address and you do, and the interface tells you, no. This is not the right address. But you know that this is the right address because you've been living there for the last 5 years. But the interface tells you, no, that address is invalid, please correct it. So what can you do then? The only chance or the only thing you can do at this point is leave, right? This is what you're going to do. You just abandon because there is no way for you to proceed. So we always need to think about those exceptions, and we always need to give people a way out. For example, contacting customer support or proceed despite the fact that the validator thinks, that the input is wrong, right? And overall, I would say the clarity of how we present things in these particular settings in a complex enterprise setting should be probably more important than aesthetics or in the end of what it looks like. One thing that I really learned is that the density of information is very different in this kind of regular interfaces that we might be designing very often and those complex enterprise products, right? You'll have a lot of information density where you show just a lot, which is not necessarily the case in other scenarios. Now let's take a look at some examples and just see what I mean by all of that. It might sound a little bit abstract, generic. Let's just break it down into something that we all can use. And let's start with something that is probably everywhere, like in every single project, navigation, of course, right? And again, I'm not talking about a little hamburger icon or accordion here and there. I'm thinking about literally systems like this. How can we make them better, right? And there are obviously options. There are obviously different ways of how we can do that. One of them is, we learned this in the past, we're just going to use a mega hover menu. So whenever you're hovering over one of the sections, you kind of end up showing or seeing some options available. And sometimes it's literally dozens, maybe even hundreds sometimes of different options where you can navigate to, right? This is actually quite common to see this, but you can also see that there is a lot of problems that actually show up when you start using hover menus. One of the typical things is the hover tunnels, especially if you have multiple sub-levels, right, where you have to go from level 1 to level 2 to then go to level 3, kind of often becomes a little bit of a problem just because you end up missing that area which you need to travel, or kind of leaving the funnel or the tunnel, and you end up just closing that bar, right? And so you have to start over again. That's very frustrating, very annoying. And I'm sure that most of you have been in this situation before. right? That's one problem that shows up here. So if you have any kind of mega sub drop-down menus, this is going to be a big problem most of the time. Another problem is the position where it's placed. So if you have an important element, like let's say search, right above the hover menu, there will be this overcast effect where whenever you're moving towards the search, you end up disrupting people just because you have the navigation in between the search and the results of that search. That's always becoming an issue too. And we kind of thought for a while that we resolved this issue for good, right? Because we ended up with a few really good patterns for this. One of them is delays. So when we look at this example here, we have this little delay showing up, right? And so it's not as abrupt as in the previous example. And also you kind of need to express your intent very consciously by staying on that item on a navigation item for a while, maybe like 100, 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds, so it can be registered. That causes problems as well, because you're always going to be slowed down as a result of that. And also you still don't have any control when things open, when things are closing, right? One way of dealing with this, which is a bit alternative, would be something like this, where you have this triangle pattern that Amazon has become very known for, right? And as long as a person who is hovering over one of the sections is staying within that triangle, and that triangle is essentially calculated based on the length of that panel that you're displaying, right? You just keep displaying that thing. As long as somebody is staying with this triangle, you kind of keep displaying this, right? The problem is that we're assuming a certain movement and transition, which might not be necessarily the case, because somebody might be moving like this, right? Or might be moving like this, you know, if they have something that's maybe, if you have even a longer one, a taller section here on the right, they might be kind of really going all the way to the top to then actually continue here, right? So there are many, many things like that that we can actually see in testing, right? This has been now changed into something that looks a little bit more like this, where we're creating this more accurate pattern, right? To be sure that people are staying within the triangle. And that's essentially the way it works, is because we want to be responsive, of course, it's being calculated based on the position of the element on the screen, and of course the cursor that we have as well. So if you at some point start scrolling, obviously this triangle or this area needs to be calculated, so we can be certain that we're still kind of accessing the right area. So it's a little bit more dynamic, but with it come, of course, some complexities on its own. In general, tests show that click menus do not perform worse than hover menus. They don't necessarily bring conversion up or anything like that, but it just brings more control to the users, which is actually usually a good idea. That's a very similar example that we saw before, but here everything is happening on click and nothing disappears until you click away, right? And so it's kind of exactly the same pattern, but it's just much calmer here. And you know, you're kind of avoiding all kind of issues that we had previously in the previous example, right? And also, obviously, because it's tapping and clicking, right? At this point, we're supporting mobile by default, right? Because on mobile, we don't really have hover anyway. So first rule, definitely a good idea to move away from hover menus to click menus, or combine both. That's an interesting idea from the Visit Antwerpen website, where it really kind of tries to combine both. You have the click menu, and as you go from one page to the next, it kind of acts as a click menu. It doesn't get closed automatically. But then whenever you hover over one of the sections, they show up, even although the other section is, you know, operating on click, right? So kind of allows you, which is something very unique, I think, it allows you to see multiple levels of navigation at the same time by using this kind of mega menu, right? I think it has a lot of potential to explore, not necessarily, you know, for every project, but it's interesting to be able to see multiple levels of navigation if necessary, right? Now, in general, moving away from kind of this mega hover menu to mega click menu is always probably going to be a good idea. It's definitely not going to make anything worse, right? But we can do more than that. One example is, that's probably the most boring of them all, is horizontal layering, where we're using different layers of navigation, which we place vertically, indicating the hierarchy on the page. So whatever is on the very top is the global navigation, whatever is underneath is the first level, the second level, the third level. And it's not uncommon to see some websites actually having 4, 5, even 6 levels of navigations like that. The only issue is that it requires a lot of space. Now, here's what it looks like. This is just a very simple and sorry, probably very boring example of BBC. We have this the homepage. On the homepage, we have this global navigation. You click on one of the sections on the top. Let's say you click on sport, have another horizontal bar, horizontal layer showing up, right? In there, you might be choosing one of the options that you find quite important, quite interesting to you. Like, for example, maybe Gaelic games, because this is probably interesting. And then you have another layer. And sometimes as you scroll down, you see another sticky bar showing up as well. So sometimes literally like 3 to 4 levels. This works. It might appear very boring, but this does work. There are no problems with it at all. The only thing to consider here is that most of the time, this navigation just fully disappears on mobile. And that's a very, very expensive mistake that many companies do, because it is a very important and a very good idea to show as much navigation as you can. Right. So this is a reason why in the Guardian, for example, we have this primary navigation here, and then we have this secondary level navigation where they try to show as much as possible, right? And then obviously there is a more button, and whenever you click on it, you actually see even more, right? They could have gone with just using the hamburger icon alone, but research shows that whenever we're hiding anything behind the hamburger icon, compared to just exposing those navigation items right here, right, you should be expecting less people coming to those sections. That's just the fact. There are plenty of case studies proving that. So if you show this navigation right here, you should be expecting more people going there. You might not want that. Maybe navigation is not as important as, let's say, a call to action that you have, but that needs to be a conscious decision. In general, having just the hamburger icon and nothing else is usually difficult, not necessarily the optimal solution, right? And obviously, there are plenty of other examples of this pattern in use. Sometimes where you have this global navigation on the top, which has maybe kind of acting on click, like opening all these different bars right there, right? But then you also have this secondary navigation that stays sticky, right? I think in many ways, some people will be expecting that this is navigation within a page, right? But it might not be a bad idea if you're expecting a lot of people navigating through all the siblings of that page a lot, right? In that case, this is actually a really, really good idea to do so. And here's an example of probably one of my reference examples when it comes to any kind of complicated navigation menu, right? You end up with a lot of stuff happening, and there are a lot of columns, and they all open on click, as they should be, right? And then whenever you open one of them, kind of combine the breadcrumbs, the sticky bar, right, and the global navigation with the click menu in one. So you navigate through the page, right? So you go through the page, and the sticky bar really helps to navigate there. At the same time, you can jump quickly between different levels on the top, or even using breadcrumbs, which I think is actually quite important. And we'll talk about breadcrumbs in just a moment as well, right? So very good example just to keep in mind whenever you're designing or building anything, right? An alternative to that, and I do spend a bit more time than I was thinking about navigation, but I think it's quite important. Another aspect of that is a sidebar navigation that many companies as well have. And one of the most difficult aspects of it is the consistency of displaying navigation all the time. And we should also minimize the space needed to explore information. Just to give you an example here. So this is a beautiful, wonderful site of Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I have the sidebar navigation on the left. The problem is, we're showing 2 free levels. That's perfectly fine. But the problem is that every time I'm exploring this sidebar navigation, I have to scroll down, because if I just pause for a moment and I look at just how much space is dedicated to navigation and how much space is dedicated to content, that's not necessarily the right fit. Because here, literally, this entire space is navigation, right? All the way on the top here is navigation. This entire space on the left is navigation. Now that's sidebar navigation. And only this part here, oops, I just clicked accidentally. Only this part that was in the middle is actually content. Ideally, we should be pushing the content to be all the way on the top. So navigating through the sidebar and content would be easier, right? An example of this would be something like this. Maybe not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasant design, right? But it does everything right. So content is taking most of the space. The navigation is kind of a little bit reduced or dimmed. And just think about the speed of interaction when you're actually going through all the subsections. That's incredible. That's something that you barely see, to be honest. Here's another example of something similar from the Statistics of Sweden website, right? Where you also get these cards, and then you get the sidebar navigation. And I mean, we could maybe push the content a little bit up, right? But you never have to scroll down to consume content at first, right? So this is what we probably need to try to achieve when it comes to sidebar navigation as well. And a really great way of doing this would be to decouple the navigation you have on the left from the content you display on the right. That means that whenever people click, here and there, you need to change the URL, but at the same time kind of load the content in, so you never have to scroll. You can always start reading immediately while having the sidebar in a particular state, collapsed, open, sections open, and so on and so forth. Right? All of this is actually quite significant and can make quite a difference as well. Just two more things here, which I think are quite important and very often underestimated, is a Z pattern, which is very often dismissed as something from the 90s, like who would use this AZ index pattern, right? But it's really important when you have a lot of content, especially legacy content on a website. And it also is important that when people use it, you need to understand that they probably will be using some keywords. So the labeling of whatever you're displaying in the AZ pattern is critical. So these are all the different examples of this in use. Most government websites will have that. Healthcare will have that. That's very, very typical, right? And usually it looks pretty much like this, where you just have everything listed based on keywords that you're using. And you just go from one to the next until you find what you need, right? Sometimes you see this happening on separate pages, sometimes all on one page. In general, all on one page is better because people might be using in-page search as a result of that, right? But you can even take it to the next level, because what we see here is just a bunch of keywords, right? Right here, just a bunch of keywords, and that's pretty much it. But you could just try to make more of it, right? Maybe, like we see here at the University of Antwerp website, have different filters for those indexes that we have. We have different information that's displayed right there. So instead of going to the page, you're kind of exposing most important information immediately, right? That's pretty great, right? Or even here, what you get on the foreign policy website in Germany, right, where you basically have these multiple columns, right, and then you don't refresh the page every time, but instead just show all the things, kind of loading them in a very similar way, like you did with filters previously, right, or with the sidebar previously, right? Pretty great stuff. And one thing that I think is really interesting at this point as well is this notion of adding it as a part of global navigation tool. Here on the University of Aarhus in Denmark, whenever you're choosing one of the, what you're looking for, your role as a student, you just get to choose or go straight to where you want to be very, very quickly, right? Just by essentially enabling or adding this A to Z index into navigation right there, right? There's going to be plenty more things that we're going to cover tomorrow as well, right? But these are probably some of the most important ones. Moving on to something that's actually quite more common, even more common for really complex interfaces, you find a lot of filters, right? And these filters often are broken, utterly broken. Now, this is an example of this in action. So when we just start using this interface, right, what we see here is, a commerce setting, we have filters on the left and we have results on the right. And every time you click, you assume that it's registered. So you kind of move on clicking, but you don't see any update. You might be expecting an apply button, right? But then all of a sudden there is a refresh and all your input is gone, right? This is actually remarkably typical, and it's extremely frustrating in usability test. Once this happens twice, you can be certain for a user, you can be certain that they're going to leave, right? This is really, really, really bad experience for customers. It happens on many different levels. Here, we have just nothing happens for a while because apparently results are coming from the server and it takes a bit of time, right? Just the interface is just slow. Here's another example of a similar problem too, where we actually end up using those filters, but then every time you hit one single filter, right, you're being scrolled down to the top of the page and the entire page freezes, right? So every time you need to use a filter, you have this experience where you're being scrolled all the way to the top, and then you have to go back to continue your filtering. And because many people are filtering from top to bottom, right, this is a really frustrating experience as well, right? So this is not a great experience, right? And this actually happens all the time. So maybe there is a way to improve it, right? And a way to improve it would be maybe doing something like this, right? And this is for me, again, another reference example for any kind of filtering and search. That's, for me at least, in my experience, this is probably the ideal way of doing this in 2022. Now, what do we do here? Now we have search, we have results, we have filters. They are decoupled. So you can click on any filter you like, as much as you like, opening quadrients, closing them. There is no movement. You're not being scrolled up, right? There is no page refresh. Well, the only thing that does get refreshed is, of course, search results that appear on the right, right? But everything is very, very calm. And also every search result has some important information that help you make a decision if this is an important or useful thing for you or not, right? Why would you even try to go to the page? Very often we try to make search better by showing search results kind of faster or rank them better. But wouldn't it be more meaningful to just expose useful information right there instead of driving people to a page, right? And also, again, I want to emphasize that just decoupling the navigation, the sidebar on the left from the content we see on the right is going like it really massively increases the speed of interaction with any kind of interface of any kind of complexity. That's just incredible, right? However, if you don't have sidebar, you might do this. This is another example that is a reference example for me, but more for vertical filtering, right? And again, I'm showing an e-commerce example here, but it could be applied anywhere. And there are many moving parts that make it a really great experience. One thing is, it lives on the top whenever you're operating with it. You're not being frozen, right? You're being displayed how many items there are going to appear. And you actually start displaying or kind of refresh the results only when somebody clicks apply or close, right? It's only then when you actually refresh. So that's make sure that whenever you are operating filters, and many people, to be honest, will be operating way more than one filter, sometimes even 5, 6, 7, again, it heavily depends on the context, they never slow down at all. And that's probably a sign of a good design, right? So that's quite important, quite significant in there. And that all relates kind of to the way of how we're presenting information most of the time. Another thing which is also quite important is infinite scroll. We tend to think that infinite scroll is bad for experience and that it has all these problems from accessibility to footer issues to just many items showing up, right? In fact, what turns out is that people do dive into exploration mode, that explore more. And if you have a lot of products and you want people to explore a lot of products, then actually infinite scroll is a really good idea because they scan fast, they focus less on single items and kind of explore, and then open things, products that they find interesting in separate tabs, right? That's all great, but it has these problems, which are very, very typical. So if you look at Nike, you scroll and 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 you scroll, and eventually, if you're lucky, you will hit the footer, right? And also there is no notion of state. So if you wanted to send a link to that thing, to that particular state where you are, to continue navigating later, to a friend, to a partner, to yourself, maybe, you're out of luck. This is just not working here. You can fix it though. This is an example of an Malaysian food delivery service. And very much like we have sticky header, they have sticky footer. So they do have a scrolling infinite scroll if you want to explore all products that they have, right? But you can always open the footer if you need to, right? So here you go, the problem with sticky footer fixed, all right? On another hand, you can also combine all the things that we usually have with pagination, right, and loading more buttons, right, into one. So if this is one service from Poland, right, and in here what we get is essentially just pagination, loading more, and infinite scroll at once together, right? How does that work? Well, as you start scrolling down, if you pay attention to the URL on the top, it changes as you keep scrolling. You can always open the footer if you need to, because there is a sticky footer on the bottom right, right? And you also have this movement through pages. So you can send the link to yourself to go to the next page, to the previous page. And also you can jump to the top. This is what the link at the bottom left says, right? So all these footer issues are resolved at this point. So this works, right? This is a great addition, I would say. It's kind of all like infinite scroll really solved. So there is no reason not to use it today, right? Except, of course, when you really want people to pay close attention to particular products because you have very complex products. With infinite scroll, people just tend to scan much faster and pay less attention to individual items, right? However, even although you might have this, you still might have some issues just because you have a lot of content to organize or a lot of filters to display, right? And in this particular case, even IKEA looks fantastic, looks beautiful, but there is still just a lot of information, a lot of content, a lot of products. So even if you set a few filters, you will have hundreds, literally hundreds of products appearing, right? And that could be an issue. So there is a way to make this better as well. Because normally, whenever people explore a complex experience, a complex site like this, they will be filtering first and then sorting in that order. So they might also be searching first, or they might be using a browser navigation at first, right? But then eventually filtering and sorting will be the last. So you can make sorting a little bit more useful with so-called scroll bar range intervals, where you allow people to scroll down to the boundaries of interest by highlighting where they are, like this, right? So it's like if you ever use Google Photos, this is a pattern where it's coming from as well. Right, where essentially you're highlighting, okay, you're sorting by pricing from low to high. Well, why don't we just put some labels to this page where we're kind of indicating, right, where person is currently is. So if they start scrolling, right, they know where they are, but even better, they can click at 210 and jump right there where 210 as a price starts, right? And of course, it needs to be dynamic. So if you have anything like an infinite scroll, right, it needs to be changing dynamically as users are moving, right? Or maybe in steps. But you also can use it for pagination, right? This could be another option here, where you're kind of highlighting to let people know where they are going to jump. Because if you just show page 5 in a pagination, what does it even mean, right? Why would you want to jump to page 5? It's more like a guess that they will find something meaningful on page 5. So what we can do is use whatever it is that they're sorting by, or if they don't sort and just use default sort, maybe use filter instead with default sorting and kind of scatter or sprinkle a little bit of this information detail about what they should be expecting on those pages, right? This could be actually quite useful as well. No, that's all great. And again, when we'll look into this in in much more detail tomorrow, it will all kind of make sense in the global scale of things and how do we get to this kind of navigation system in the first place. But there is also another really complex component which we need to tackle, and that's tables. Now, tables are no fun. And I think that most of the time they're just extreme headache because they don't work well on mobile at all. And very often, even on desktop, they're very difficult to get right. And it's very important to understand that whenever we have any kind of table, it's an extremely intense thing. So even a table like this, right, which looks beautiful and straightforward, right? Mentally, it requires a lot of effort to find the information that you are looking for. If you're dealing as a customer with this kind of tables every day, this is going to be quite a headache because you always need to scan and you always need to jump. In reality, when we're looking what people are doing, it is very common that people are looking for particular patterns. They want to see, oh, okay, what happened here? And then they jump until they get to that point of interest, which is why they often need customization in terms of columns being hidden, being displayed, in terms of the order of columns, in terms of some extra information that they might need to see. And all of that has to work both on desktop and on mobile, right? Which is not easy at all. Now, what you see with these kind of tables, pretty much every table most of the time, is the so-called the lawn mower pattern, where people are methodically scanning those tables row by row from right to left and then back again, and they're kind of moving in the zigzag pattern, which is also why, by the way, we actually use the layout on the left most of the time when it comes to landing pages, right? Because we want to expose people to some content without them being able to simply skip something that they don't find interesting, right? So in general, for informational systems, this layout works better, but for landing pages, this layout is probably going to work much better, right? In fact, if we look into some heat maps of that, we'll find that in here, if you just take the same page and just have this alternate layout and have the straight layout, right? You end up more people paying attention to text in, when you alternate, while here people tend to ignore either one thing or the other more. So in general, less engagement, less attention spent with this kind of layout for landing pages, and more attention and more engagement can be found in this kind of layout. So when we apply this to the context of tables, right, we'll find out that, when people operate tables, it's a very intense experience. People have to do this, kind of really be actively engaged all the time, right? Which is really, really, really consuming. So what can we do with this? Well, if we deal with a table like this, there is a single pattern that always works, like charm. You can never go wrong with it. It just really works well. And the idea is we need to translate the transition or navigation between columns and between rows into something that's just more manageable on mobile. So here what we get is just columns, and some of them are important. We have these different multi-sorting features over here, right? And then we have different values. And so what we need to explore, of course, what kind of information, what kind of tasks do people do here, right? And in fact, when we're speaking about tasks, we need to think about top tasks analysis, which is going to be, as a UX methodology, extremely useful to identify which features are important, what navigation is important, and then later prioritize it, right? So in here, what we can explore is how do people navigate this? Now, this is a risk assessment table. So imagine somebody going into buildings and assessing, how safe it is, right? What are the risks of fire showing up, or water sprinkler protection, things like that? Like how does it work in this particular building? And they assign scores, and then they need to analyze that data somehow. And that means that kind of trying to look into, okay, what are across all the buildings that we are monitoring, which are the ones that are most difficult, right? That require attention. Or for a particular building, show me the information that I need. So much of the time, we will be either moving horizontally, kind of row by row, exploring, okay, I need to know everything about that particular building, right? Like this. Or we'll be looking into the set of buildings that we have, maybe segmented set of buildings, maybe only the ones from the US, right? And we will be monitoring particular attributes that are important to us, and we should be able to select them, right? So if you want to enable this on mobile, this works all the time. You explore to support people to either navigate by like this, or maybe multiple columns at a time, right? Or like this. That means we're looking at only one building at a time, right? On mobile, then it looks like this. We have a drop-down and cards to navigate between columns. It might also be a multi-combo box where you can select multiple items, and then every single section that you get here, right, it becomes kind of card that contains multiple items from both of these columns, right? That would be quite important. So that means, for example, because this column is going to be sticky, this is the building ID, right? This is the one we're going to display here. But then additionally to one number that we have over here, we could be displaying, 2 more columns or 3 more columns, right, at a time. And so you kind of navigate between columns this way, right? And if you need to navigate between rows, you jump in and then you get information about everything in that building. Additionally, you could have these tabs on the top, up to 4 or 5 tabs or so, right? To kind of indicate where people maybe particular presets or particular sets of columns or sets of rows that people might find important. An example here as a set of rows would be Americas, like everything from America, maybe everything from Europe, depending on, again, of what might be interesting for you. And you might be even able to customize it as well, right? So there are plenty of things that we could do there. And one important detail here would be to enable people to hide fields if they're not relevant, right? There are plenty of patterns for this. One common way of doing this would be allowing people to just change the arrangement and then being able to hide or close, some columns. A nice way of doing this is on Thinkific, where you get this columns button, and then you tap on it, and then you basically select what columns you want to see, right? As simple as this. On Airtable, it looks a little bit different, where you can toggle on and toggle off and then move around these columns as well, right? Which is quite important. And then in here, for example, this is just a mock-up from Alfred. What you end up is this overlay on mobile, which allows you to do multiple things, which I think is great. You can select items. You can do multiple actions, like batch action with them. You can sort. You can edit columns and kind of move them around, or even turn to stacked layout, And whenever you click on it, you basically end up with cards. So that's probably a little bit more convenient than using a table here, right? So that's pretty reliable and useful at this point as well, right? And finally, the final thing I do want to highlight today, somebody's doing something outside, I guess, is dealing with forms, right? Forms are beasts on their own. And in fact, it doesn't matter what we're doing, we also will end up with some forms because they literally are everywhere. And I kind of got this habit over the last 2 years to question everything we're doing in interface design when it comes to forms, everything. For example, when I look at this form here, we're asking for an email address, and then we're asking to repeat email address, right? Why? And I'm wondering at this point, how many of you would just go ahead and copy paste the email address you type in here into that field anyway, unless it's blocked, of course, right? And then also we have this asterisks, fields marked with asterisks are required. Now we're living in 2022. Is it still the time when we need to mark, required fields with asterisks, or is it just, 90s greet us today, right? We'll talk about it in a moment, but I always question everything, to the point that it's very difficult for me to read books because I question every single sentence I read in a book right now, right? And there are many things that we really need to ask ourselves, right? So, for example, one thing that we also need to ask ourselves is, how do we talk about design? Because when I think about this kind of pattern, is the bad design, is the good design, right? Is it, how can we be objective about our assessment of design? What are the design KPIs or design metrics? So much of my work was really about this, because I cannot just come in and say, hey, I think that this is going to be done this way because it's better. That doesn't matter what I think, right? I need to prove it. So I always need to think about some KPIs. And a very good KPI would be the timing needed and the accuracy of input, right? Which also means how many mistakes happen and how quickly do people recover from those mistakes, right? So this is an option, but I would argue that maybe it's not the fastest, because again, the select dropdown turns out to be the slowest element to deal with when it comes to forms, right? In the same way, sometimes, the date picker is just absolutely weird and irrelevant, because here, this is one where I have to fill in my detail from my date of birth, right? And I can be quite objective about this, because this is not keyboard accessible. I cannot just type with my keyboard. Instead, I'm forced to use this keyboard widget, this calendar widget, and it took me 53 seconds to fill in my date of birth. I don't know about you, but I have a feeling that most people have a very clear understanding of what their birthday is, right? This is just 8 numbers that they can simply type in. This is probably going to be much faster than going through the calendar widget, which is also quite obscure and unfortunately native in browsers, right? This is not necessarily a great experience. So here, a date picker is probably not needed at all. Not to mention even things like this, right? The same story, where we have selector for the date and time in one. And this is also native material Android thing, right? And I'm wondering, why are we doing this? Why, first of all, why do we need to combine time and date in one? Wouldn't it be much faster if I could just type in an index, in an input field, right? And it all boils down to the time that would be needed. For me personally, all of these examples would probably be better. I mean, maybe not the first one, would be better off with this, right? 3 simple input fields, and you just type, and that's it. Right? That's probably going to be easier, right? So all of this, we really need to question everything that we're doing, because most of the time I think we just follow conventions, which might not be ideal, right? So let's take a look at a few more examples. I think I have around 5 minutes left at this point. We asked, how do we mark required and optional input, right? One thing is very certain: if we don't mark anything, that people will get confused, because they will expect much of the form is required, or they will just not know what is optional. That's not ideal. Now, obviously, we could say, let's just mark only optional. And in fact, many interfaces will do that, right? And personally, if I would start a new project, I would probably start with this, right? I'm just going to mark only optional, and that's it, and see if people actually make sense of it. If it doesn't work, right, then I'll probably go ahead and mark both optional and required, right, and see if this works better. Because there are some situations, especially if you want to create a universal system that works for everyone, right? Literally everyone. You want to be as explicit and clear and unambiguous as possible. And this is unambiguous, right? So of course, you know, we can compare this and say, oh, this looks nice and this looks not so great, but we always need to think about it in context of a complex application that we're dealing with, or complex information systems that we're dealing with, right? In here, we cannot tell which ones are optional, which ones are required, right? Here, I still find it a bit difficult to, even although optional is marked, right? Here, now I know exactly what is required. And the rest, which is not marked, is then optional, right? The only thing that it probably wouldn't do is things like this, which is also an option because it's just too screaming. It seems like it's an error message right there, right? So that's probably not necessary. I'll probably stick with optional only or only required and optional. In fact, studies show that both would work. So there is a study from Baymert Institute. Oh, hold on, let me just jump there. Baymert Institute that actually recommends to highlight both. Nielsen-Norman group recommends to do the same. However, in my experience, my personal experience, usually it's perfectly fine if only optional is marked and required is not, right? But, you know, we can have these two options and start with highlighting only optional and then adding required if necessary. A very common problem shows up when we start talking about tooltips, right? Tooltips are a problem because they cover users' input, right? Specifically, some of you might have been in this situation before where you go ahead and you need to fix an error that you're being displayed, but there is no way for you to fix it because there is an overlay that actually breaks you, kind of slows you down from doing just that. This is where some requirements might be showing up, anything like that. And what we absolutely need to achieve is that people are able to fill in the data while at the same time reading that hint that we're providing to them, right? And there are different ways of how it could be presented. This is maybe a slightly better way of doing this, right? Especially if you have a lengthier hint, right? But this is still potentially covering users' input. And one thing that we can do to fix it is to not use tooltips and instead use these little accordions or hints, which is coming from Adam Silver on gov.uk, right? Where the idea is, well, why don't we just show it right here as a link, and then whenever people open it, they can always read that content here, that hint, while typing at the same time. That solves many problems that we usually would have with tooltips like focus management and so on and so forth, right? Another thing I think is really quite important to highlight here is the notion of disabled buttons, right? Maybe I need just 3 more minutes, dear friends, and then I should be done. With disabled buttons, what we usually see is them being extremely expensive for businesses. And very often businesses don't even realize how expensive they are, right? Because in an interface that looks maybe, let's say like this, where you have this next button, but that button is disabled. That disabled button doesn't communicate what exactly is wrong. It communicates that something is missing and people understand that, but it doesn't tell them how to fix that. And very often it relies on inline validation, which is not necessarily bulletproof, right? At this point, we could be, instead of just disabling a button altogether, we could just give people a hint about what they need to do to fix that, right? Because maybe they don't know how to fix it, how to make it enabled, right? And in fact, when you look around, there are plenty of interfaces where it becomes a major problem. This is with transfer.com, and for a while, I think, just had a bit of a problem with JavaScript. So the entire interface was unusable. If your JavaScript is broken, that's a valid reason for that. But there is nothing I can do. If a button is disabled, I cannot proceed. The only thing I can do is leave. And very often what you see in many insurance companies or in many car manufacturers that I was working with, this is actually a big deal because people just leave, right? Because they don't know how to proceed. We always need to think about a way to give them a way out. Remember, one of the principles that I highlighted, we always need to think about a way to give people a way out, right? How can we do that? Well, we can do that by maybe making this button enabled or keeping it enabled, and instead allowing people to jump to the errors where they've made them, right? For example, like this. Another way of dealing with this would be to say, hey, you can't proceed, choose a journey first with a link focusing directly on that area that they need to kind of act on, right? and then they probably will understand, hopefully, what's going on. Another option is to say, Cant Proceed, let us know, we'll email you shortly, which would open a model. In that model, they need to type in the email address, and all the data that they have submitted already or they have entered already will be sent to customer support so they can deal with it, right? One thing that we tested was doing something like this, right? Or maybe a little bit more like this, continue with errors. Now that people don't understand, but the idea is we need to indicate to people that they can proceed despite the fact that validator doesn't agree with them. That would be happening not at the level of button, continue button, should probably still say continue, right? Or continue to checkout or anything like that. But whenever you have a shipping address, let's say, that's not recognized for some reason, right, by in validator, what you need to allow people to do is to say, okay, I'm sure that my input is correct, so they can still proceed. Otherwise, you'll just lose them for sure, right? Which is actually a very, very expensive thing altogether. And then maybe just one final thing I want to leave you with at this point is very often we are really struggling with those little things. And I think that, you know, coming back here, email address, you know, when we're looking into email address, there is a right time and there is a wrong time to ask for email address. Whenever you enter in a commerce site and you're being asked for the email address, there is a high chance that people will be giving either a fake email address or a secondary email address or a temporary email address, but not a primary email address. But as a business, I want good emails. I want emails that have low bounce rate, that have high opening rate, where people act on them. So ideally, the email that people check regularly, right? I don't want any random email. So we need to ask ourselves, when is the right time to ask for email? And more specifically, when is the right time for people to give us the right email and how to check that, right? Email address, repeat email address pattern doesn't work anymore. We need to be smart on that. One thing that we ended up doing is whenever you're asking for email, you also need to type, we'll send a confirmation to this email, or we'll send a coupon code to that email, or anything like that, right? So that gives people a motivation, at least, to give or provide an accurate email address. And also, just before they hit the finish button in your process, and just after they've done that, you need to ask to verify that email again. So they have a chance to resend email, to resend them confirmation or a message or whatever to another email as well, right? So just before they hit the finish button, we can allow them to revisit the email, and just after they've done that, because here on this page, on this confirmation page, people stay and linger and do not close that page. And they will take screenshots and save it as PDF just to make sure that they have that, because maybe email will not arrive. So this is when they check the email inbox to make sure that that email arrives. And if it doesn't, they have a chance to resend it to another email, which is also quite helpful at this point, right? Okay, so with all of this in mind, right, I think it's quite important that when we are thinking about what we're designing today and how we're designing for these complex UIs, you know, very often we think about applying the very same principles that we're used to this context of really complex interfaces. Very often it's not going to work. In my experience, one thing that really definitely works in one will not work in the other. And we always need to question some of the patterns that we're using or seeing most of the time, because they are really probably not going to work. They will not work for sure in complex interfaces, but they're probably not going to work on simpler interfaces either. And the final thing is, that is, I think, important to understand is, even although the product might be inherently complex because of this expert knowledge that's deeply ingrained in it, right? We don't need to make interfaces complex, right? Because we can hide this complexity under the surface by providing interface controls and essentially an interface that people can deal with fast. That means eliminating slowdowns, improving clarity, and making it very, very damn hard to make mistakes. And that's kind of something I want to really leave you with. So I hope that this was useful, and I hope that I will see some of you at this, maybe even many of you, tomorrow in the workshop, where we're going to dive into a lot of detail on just that. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm all here.
Thank you very much, Vitali. We don't have any questions from this side. Thank you very much for your time and your effort. It was great.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you.